my talk really is about a framework that I started to develop prior to the pandemic, but really came to fore during the pandemic through my work with working with academic staff and their kind of digital skills integration as part of their academic development. So I just checked, there we go. So this is a presentation in two parts. The first part is something that I call conscious modality. We'll come to that. And then the other one is when we come to design curriculum, what I'm terming a considered curriculum in the context of that modality. But there's a really nice quote that I picked up, you know, when you're reading all the people's experiences and the extent to which we're heading in that direction. I'm not so sure, because you've talked about the snapback, this idea that actually, oh, we didn't really like that online bit, so we're all going to come back to on campus. And there's a real tension now between the extent to which we provide an on-campus experience for our students, where it is an on-campus organisation that they've come to, compared to how much we kind of blend or hybridize that experience. So we might touch on that a little bit. So conscious modality, I think. So first of all, terminology, because this is where staff really get kind of hung up on things, is I use the term hybrid, and the reason for that, I'll just move that away so you can see. The reason I use that is because for me, hybrid is about making a choice, a conscious decision about when to use one mode and when to use another. So if you take a hybrid vehicle, inside the vehicle is a whole set of sensors that are making decisions about when it uses the combustion engine and when does it use the electric motors. When is it more effective on that journey to use the electric motor? When is it more effective to use the combustion engine? And we have to, I think, consciously decide when to use different modes. So I use the term hybrid because it's akin to the hybrid nature of the technology that's around us. You may use blended or something else, but maybe as a reference point, I'll put this up because this work by Sue Beckingham, I think, is really useful to help frame consistent language around the terminology. Because if you go to any organisation, a higher education institution, FE institution, business, and you throw the word blended into a room, you'll end up with 20 or 30 different definitions of that. So I wanted to just say that mine is definitely centred around hybrid, and hybrid is the term that I use to mean this conscious decision-making process. But I think this is the work that Sue did during the pandemic has really helped shape my thinking around terminology as well. So I suppose I ought to say where this started. I spent many years working with this framework here. Anybody know what it's called? Oh, there we go. The answer is on the slide. The TPAC framework by Mishra and Kula, which was developed really in the early 2000s, but kind of emerged out in about 2005, 2006. And I used it as a framework for what I call digitally integrated academic development. So really not separating out the digital development of academic staff, but seeing it as an holistic mechanism to kind of get staff on board. The problem with that is the staff always focused on the T bit. It really used to frustrate me when they'd always talk about the tool, the technology, whether it's now we're talking about chat AI, but you know, talking about the VLE or talking about the e-portfolio system or talking about the lecture capture system, whatever the technology was. And I felt as if that wasn't helpful in the context of trying to see themselves as academics and it's just learning, that the digital bit is just the tool bit they're using. So I ended up starting to develop a framework, and what emerged was this, over the pandemic, was this framework which I call SPaM, the Subject, Pedagogy and Modality framework. And it's absolutely has to be in that order, I think, because the way academic colleagues think about their own development starts here. They always think about the development of their subject, their discipline first. And there's no point us ignoring that and just flying straight into it, because, bless you, because the first thing you'll find is that then if you throw the technology in too soon, they lose a disconnect. So this is kind of set up so they think about subject first, then the relationship with pedagogy, and then I kind of bring in modality just to confuse them and throw things into the mix. So I'll just keep moving this so that it doesn't in the way of the text for you or in the room. Okay, so the idea of the framework is you can use any context, but it's really got these three interlinked, interconnected domains. The first one, which is the subject, is identifying and selecting knowledge areas that you think you want students to learn. So the framework is based around curriculum design, really. How do you design curriculum in the context of a modern hybrid education? So you start off with this area of thinking, well, we normally all start off with identifying what we want students to learn, and we write those out as learning outcomes, whether they're program level, unit, module level. We normally have a good sense of what we want students to have learned by the end of this semester, the end of this topic. The other thing we then consciously or subconsciously do is we start to look at how are we going to teach this. What pedagogic approaches are we going to use? Are we going to use team-based learning? Are we going to use lecture-style teaching? Are we going to use workshop style? And then the question that we all had to answer post-pandemic was, oh, now which mode? What modes are we going to teach in? So I kind of get my subject. I've been doing pedagogy in all sorts of ways prior to the pandemic, and I had to switch them a bit during the pandemic. But now we really need to surface the questions around what modality looks like and how we make sure that modality is as integral to the design process as the subject and the pedagogy. So the questions that I kind of bring to a workshop with staff that are kind of thinking about hybrid education curriculum is, what is it that you will teach the students and what is it they will learn? That's the easy bit. Nobody has a problem with that at all. They can easily come up with what they want to teach. How will you teach this subject and how will we assess the learners? And normally, these are kind of very traditional answers. Some staff will come and they will have had experiences in the pandemic that they've retained. So there will be kind of some change to that. But then when we start to rethink the modality is the bit where they get stuck. And then when you start to talk about modality, you realize that discussions there influence this and influence sometimes the subject as well. So you can never divorce you can never separate the three components. They're kind of an homogeneous set of parameters that in a modern hybrid education we're going to have to grapple with. Hopefully we're back. See, this is the reality of the challenge that we live. This is real life these days, isn't it? Is how do you create that hybrid high flex experience, and how do you design for it? I'll put my cards on the table. I don't think it's really possible for us to deliver high quality, high flex experiences. I think it's a nice to have, and you've done a great job of allowing people to peek into that. But, at the University of Manchester, we are now designing a high flex space because we really want to test that. It's not the bit of my talk, but I just want to put that on the table that I don't think actually unless we design rooms to high flex, we're going to find that real challenging. So I don't think we really should be offering high flex unless students know that it's probably not as good remoting in. Don't promise them that it's going to be as good as the actual in-person maybe. But colleagues may have different views on that in the chat. So these are the four main modes around which we organise conversations. In person on campus we'll be familiar with online synchronous, online asynchronous, and then the one which not everybody does, but actually is more prevalent than you might think, is in person off campus. So that includes peer-to-peer learning, students doing peer-to-peer learning. That might be work-based learning, and it may also be field trips. So we have to kind of bring that into the mix because it's definitely something that we have to design for. So my value proposition of modality, and this is probably where I still don't have enough answers, is understanding how do we kind of identify the value of each mode, the value proposition of those modes. And that's the next bit of research that I'm going to be doing with colleagues at Manchester, is how do we start to articulate the value of each mode so that when we're designing for it, we can understand that, and it might be an emotional value, it could be a social connectivity value, it doesn't always have to be an educational value. But the questions we can ask ourselves are still relevant. What can and can't be taught through certain modes? We should start to kind of articulate those and start to make a note of the things that we think are working and not working and ask our students that too. How accessible are particular modes? So some modes are more accessible than others, and accessible is a very broad term, but some modes are very accessible to students that have physical disabilities. That means they travel onto campus. Like somebody who has caring responsibilities, an online session might be more accessible to them. But some people find online experiences challenging, and they would find the in-person session more accessible. But it definitely has to be part of the discussion, the extent to which we understand that the mode that we're teaching in is accessible or inaccessible. To what extent can certain modes support student participation, engagement and active learning? Because I believe that we need students to be involved in learning. It's not a passive activity. To what extent can certain modes support cohort cohesion and student well-being? Because that's something that's really emerged out of the post-pandemic conversation, is how do we create these social activities alongside our learning activities, and then which modes work best for certain activities. I don't have the answers to all those, but these are the questions I pose out to people, and we have a discussion around what works in each context. So I think us understanding the value of modality has got to be critical to its effectiveness. So with that conscious modality, making a conscious decision about which mode to use in which context for your teaching, I think will become much more prevalent as we start to redesign curriculum with hybridity at its core, a mixed modal curriculum. So that moves me on to a conscious curriculum, where we really consciously start to think about all the aspects affecting the experience of our students and design and facilitation of the impact that's going to have on teaching and learning. So we have to now consider those three domains equally together. We can't suddenly just say, oh, pop technology on, or oh, instead of running it in the lecture theatre, we'll just run it on Zoom. We've got to make a conscious design decision to move it from this physical location to another one of the modes. So these, again, questions that I'm asking myself and I'm asking others is, I think when we think about an on-campus experience, what we've got to really do now is demonstrate to our students that coming onto campus is of value to them. You would have seen a lot of headlines about empty lecture theatres and empty seminar rooms and empty tutorial spaces, but you won't have seen as many empty laboratories or performance spaces. And there's a reason for that, is because the value commodity that students recognise about coming onto campus. So if they're on campus, they recognise there's a value. So they're making a decision, a conscious decision, to arrive physically on campus or not. If they derive value from it, they will most certainly make more effort to do so. If they don't derive value from it, they won't. And the empty lecture theatres and seminar spaces suggest they don't see the value. Now, that's for us to solve. We can tell them to be on campus, but the reality is that's our problem to solve. If I come into a seminar room and it's empty and there's no students, that's a problem for me to solve. I can email all the students and say, why weren't you there? You need to be in. But they will vote with their feet. So that's a problem that we have to solve if we're coming into those empty rooms. And I think understanding modality and the value of it is critical. Again, same question for online interaction. So you can see where I'm heading is we've got to ask ourselves deep, meaningful questions around the modalities that we're teaching in. We can't make assumptions, and we can't just switch modes because we feel like it or we think it's better for us. We've got to articulate and design around each of those modes. So as an example, and this is an example from a workshop, is I get colleagues to map against the SPaM framework. And this was a topic they wanted students, I think this was research methods, was it phenomenography? Yeah, it's one of my favorites. So this was a topic, a research methods topic, and they currently delivered the entire thing as lecture seminar. And I said, well, what if you didn't? If you take your learning outcomes of that session, that topic, how might you start to think about it against the different modes that are available to you and the kind of pedagogic approaches? So this is kind of a first step. The first step of breaking down your learning and articulating it against the SPaM framework. The subject, what you want students to learn, the pedagogy, the approaches you'll take, and the modes that you might use to make that come alive and make that happen with your students. The next step then is where you start to really build it around a module or a unit, a week by week decision-making process. Again, this is kind of very top level, but the idea is that there's a whole set of topics that you're going to teach as part of that research methods module. I always go to use research methods because nobody can then bring their own subject bias to it, because the reality is that everyone agrees that research methods is quite important. So, but what they're doing is starting to make a decision around, actually, how can I change this? And how can I make sure that I'm thinking about a conscious change of mode and the rationale that sits behind that. Here's some other examples here that are kind of real lived experience examples that have started to develop. So this example in chemistry, because a lot of lab time was taken up with students learning how to do the basics, and actually it was reducing the amount of time where they could actually do meaningful experiments or meaningful interactions. So during the pandemic, they developed loads of videos and resources for that instruction, and they've kept those. They've kept those, you know, they've updated them and they've tweaked them now and they've made them look really nice. But they've kept them, and it's freed up the timetable to give more time to the second and third years that really need to get in there and get their experiments done. So there are some things that consciously we have changed. Again, psychology is quite interesting because it used to heavily, psychology is often a lot of students, often lecture-based, and what they did was they observed poor attendance, thank you, in the middle. So what they decided to do was hybridize the teaching by saying, actually, weeks 1 and 2 are critical for you to be there at, because they're the kind of foundational underpinning where you need to ask questions. And then what they did is they used a bookend model. They moved everything in between weeks 2 and 11 to be online synchronous lectures. The students weren't coming anyway much between weeks 3 to 10, so why not? And then they were able to increase student attendance by recognizing there were patterns of attendance to do. So again, triggers. History, increased use of online synchronous because they wanted to really increase their guest lecture program. And I think what it showed us is that actually the benefit of using Zoom is somebody from who's actually on site in Egypt can actually give a talk to some students while they're there. You know, the power of that technology to do that. But that's got to be a conscious design decision to do that. And then computer science again, and then geography. So I challenge subject areas to think about what's important to you as a discipline. Think about what are the critical moments of in-person interaction that you cannot do without, and those are the ones to build your hybrid teaching around. Get the on-campus things in situ first. Those are the ones that are really valuable, but you've got to articulate the value of those and then build everything else around it. So just to close then, just some points I think that I always try to keep in my mind is that modality has got to be a key consideration in that curriculum design discussion and planning. If you're not talking about modality when you're designing curriculum, it will fail to land effectively with your students. You will miss an opportunity to engage them, and you will end up with empty lecture theatres and empty seminar rooms, and even potentially empty online spaces as well. Modality needs to inform and be informed by the subject requirements and the pedagogic approaches. There's a relationship going on there. And don't forget to make use of all your experts. So I don't think it's fair for us to expect an academic member of staff to be completely cognizant and expert in all of those domains. But there are people in your organisation that will be, that can bring that voice, bring that perspective, give them a seat at the table. Work with your students. They will tell you what a good experience is, and they will tell you what a poor experience is. And you've got to be willing to accept that that is the case for them. No matter how much you might like lecturing, because you find it really rewarding and you love seeing their faces in the room, if they don't enjoy it and if they don't see value in it, more importantly, they will not turn up, and then it's a poor lecture experience for you as well. So understanding what their experience is like is critical as well. And just make sure that whatever balance, and this is the thing that the institutions are now grappling with, is the balance. You've got to communicate that to students, why some things are in person on campus, why some things are asynchronous online, why some things are synchronous online. So the OFS has made it quite clear in the blended learning review that those decisions should be pedagogically driven. So institutions that mandate today you must be at least 70% on campus will have to rethink that, because that's not what the regulator wants us to do. The regulator says all decisions about the blend have to be pedagogically driven, not systematically driven, because it should vary and will vary depending on the discipline that you're in. So that's the kind of where we are at the moment, grappling with that. So that's it. That is the SPaM framework. It's all open access. You can use whatever you want on that website to support your discussions and your work. And please do feel free to get in touch if you have any questions.
Thank you. So we have a couple of minutes for questions, if we have any.
Yes, thanks very much. Very interesting. I'm just wondering about engaging with students, because this seems to me to be absolutely critical in sort of designing the pedagogy and looking at and what works. Understand or engage with what might be the best way for them to learn. And I think there's quite a lot of literacy that needs to go into that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think we have to be much more transparent about our decision making in our curriculum design. So even if you involve students in the design process, you're only going to ever get a few students. So even if we ran design workshops with student involvement, so at the design stage, students are there, but you're only getting a small group. You're not getting the kind of full representation of that cohort. So as you start to design your curriculum, you've got to articulate why you've made certain decisions. So I think it's got to live in handbooks. So this module uses a mix of modes. These are the modes we use, and these are why we use each of those modes for different elements to articulate our decision-making process and make it much more transparent. Students really welcome that, because it gives them a sense of, oh, I understand you've been through a process, because otherwise it looks easy to make a curriculum, and it's not. It's really complex. And I think the more we surface that and make it visible to them, the much more appreciative they are, the much more engaged they are, and then they will give you much more honest feedback around whether what you thought was going to work will work.
So we have one question from online. When you're asking students what modality they would prefer, do you find there's a disparity between cohorts? I'd worry about making changes for 1 year for it to then fall flat again the next year.
Yeah, so again, this is about articulating your design decisions, and you have to be upfront that this is not a personalised learning experience for every student. And we're naive to think that we would be able to design that. There will be some modes that some students will prefer and other modes that other students will prefer, but we recognise that it's important to have a mix of modes so that at some point in that learning experience, every student's need has been considered. It's impossible to consider every student's need and adapt to it in every single session, but it's important that we can articulate that we've been through a process. We recognise that not every student will be able to engage. Now, in examples like this, what we can do is make a recording of things to say, if you can't come to synchronous sessions, we will provide recording, but we have to say it will not be as good as being there. And these are the reasons it's much better to be there.
We have one last question from the room. Sorry.
Is it the hope that you're going to try and embed this design thinking as a sort of institutional pedagogy, institutional approach? If so, how do you get there?
Yeah, so I'm currently in the University of Manchester. I was at the University of Liverpool where I started to do that. So this framework underpinned a hybrid active learning model, which still exists now. At Manchester, my role is slightly different. So you have to be kind of careful, but it's certainly informing some of our design thinking around what we're calling flexible learning, and modality is part of that. So I wouldn't say it's going to be plonked into an organisation and say, right, we're working to this framework, but the work that went into it and the conversations emerging from it are informed by it. So it will be influencing our work there, yeah.
Cool. Well, I think we're at time now, but just if we can thank all our speakers for a really interesting session.